Breaking news tonight in the case for a couple accused in a quadruple murder in Anderson County.
Right now, Amy and Ross Vilardi are in jail facing murder charges. It comes after the 2015 murders of Amy's mother, Kathy Scott, Kathy's husband, Michael Scott, Mike's mother, Barbara Scott, and Kathy's mother, Violet Taylor. For nearly a decade, the murders went unsolved until Vilardi's arrest in 2023.
Imagine this. A family of 4 brutally murdered on Halloween night. No one saw it coming. And as the case unfolds, it turns out the person who did it might not be who you think. In today's episode, we dig into one of the most chilling, unsolved murder cases in South Carolina. Today's case is one that's still haunting South Carolina, the Amy Vilardi family murder. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're new here, and let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's get into the case.
It's October 31st, 2015. The streets are filled with the laughter of children in costumes, the air crisp with the excitement of Halloween night. But in a quiet corner of South Carolina, in the small town of Pendleton, a family's fate was sealed behind closed doors. This wasn't a family caught in a Halloween prank or a harmless scare. This was a family about to be torn apart in the most brutal way imaginable. Amy Vilardi, a woman in her late 30s, lived in a trailer home with her husband, Ross Vilardi, just a stone's throw away from her family's home. The property on Refuge Road, a modest piece of land in Anderson County, South Carolina, was supposed to be a place of refuge and comfort. But by the end of the night, it would become the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. The Scott family, Amy's mother, Kathy Scott, her stepfather, Mike Scott, her grandmother, Violet Taylor, and her step-grandmother, Barbara Scott, lived in the other trailer on the same property. At first glance, they seemed like any other family. Kathy, the mother and matriarch, was the cornerstone of the household, strong yet caring. Mike, a man in his late 50s, had always been a fixture around Pendleton, with many seeing him as a hardworking, reliable figure. Violet and Barbara, both elderly women, had lived out their later years quietly in the same home, enjoying the familiarity of family and the peaceful rhythm of life. But, like any family, they weren't immune to struggles. Despite appearances, things weren't always harmonious in the Scott household. Financial issues had begun to put a strain on family relationships. Kathy's health was declining, and she and Mike had started facing some difficulties in managing their finances, especially as the family struggled to make ends meet. Amy, always by her mother's side, found herself in the midst of it all, helping where she could, but also burdened by her own challenges. Ross, her husband, had his own issues to contend with, adding more weight to Amy's shoulders. Their pet grooming business was struggling, and there was talk of debts mounting up. But it wasn't just financial problems that strained the family's dynamics. Long-standing personal disputes, especially between Amy and her mother, had begun to chip away at the once solid foundation of the family. Despite these pressures, on the surface, the life seemed relatively normal, but in the quiet moments, the tension was palpable, simmering just beneath the surface. No one could have known that, just a few short weeks before Halloween, that tension would erupt into violence so horrific it would change their lives and the town of Pendleton forever. At 2217 Refuge Road, the Scott family was preparing for another Halloween night. The decorations were up, the candy ready for trick-or-treaters. Kathy, Mike, and the elderly women of the house had no idea that the night would soon be marred by the bloodiest of tragedies. The night fell dark and silent on the property as the family members settled into their usual routines. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, but when morning came, the world would be forever changed. In the early hours of November 2nd, Amy, the daughter who had called this place home, would make a call to 911 that would forever alter the course of her life. Her voice trembled as she reported the unimaginable. "There's been a murder. I found my family dead." But what Amy didn't know then, what no one knew, was that the killer was much closer than anyone could have ever imagined. And as the investigation would unfold, the darkest truths would begin to surface. What really happened on that Halloween night? Was this a random act of violence? Or was the killer someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along? The day began like any other. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the sun broke through the early morning fog, lighting up the peaceful town of Pendleton. It was Halloween, the night of the year when masks and costumes transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. But for the Scott family, this was not going to be a night filled with laughter, joy, or candy. It would be the beginning of a nightmare, one that would haunt them forever. As the evening approached, Kathy Scott, her stepfather Mike, and her elderly mother and step-grandmother, Violet and Barbara, settled into their home. Kathy, ever the caretaker, was likely busy preparing for the evening's festivities, perhaps making sure there were enough treats for the neighborhood children. Mike, relaxed in his favorite chair, would have been in his element, quietly watching television or reading the paper. Violet and Barbara, both in their 80s, might have been enjoying the stillness of the night, or perhaps reminiscing about the past or sharing quiet conversation. The mood in the house was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon unfold. Meanwhile, across the property in the neighboring trailer, Amy Vilardi and her husband Ross prepared for a typical night as well. The Vilardis, living just a stone's throw away from the Scott family, had their own concerns. Amy had always been close to her mother, but recent tensions between them had started to surface more frequently. With Ross struggling in his business and debts beginning to pile up, Amy found herself caught between her responsibilities to her family and her own personal frustrations. But tonight, like the others, they seemed to go about their business as usual. There was no sense of foreboding, no sign of the horror that would soon descend upon them. The night dragged on. Trick-or-treaters came and went, their excited voices filling the night air as they scurried from house to house. But in the Scott household, there was no sign of the normal hustle and bustle. No laughter, no chatter, no trick-or-treaters coming to the door. As the hours ticked by, the eerie silence in the home grew more and more unsettling. It wasn't until the next morning that the horror was discovered. The discovery was as brutal as it was unimaginable. At around 10 a.m. on November 2nd, 2015, Amy Vilardi made a phone call that would forever alter the course of her life. With a trembling voice, she dialed 911 and told the operator, "I found my family. They're dead. They've been murdered." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, collected, but Amy's voice trembled with shock, disbelief, and fear. When the police arrived at 2217 Refuge Road, they were met with a scene that no one could have prepared for. The first responders, upon entering the Scott home, were struck by the grisly sight before them. 4 bodies, cold and lifeless, scattered throughout the rooms. Each victim had been murdered in a gruesome manner, their bodies showing signs of viciousness and brutality that were impossible to ignore. Kathy Scott, the mother and matriarch, had been stabbed in the chest and then shot while she was still alive. Her body, positioned near the living room, appeared to have been the first victim. Mike Scott, her husband, had also been shot and stabbed. Barbara Scott and Violet Taylor, the elderly step-grandmother and grandmother, had their throats slit and were shot post-mortem. The violence was so intense, it seemed personal. These weren't random acts of violence. This was a deliberate and calculated attack. But what was the motive? Why would anyone do this to a family who had lived peacefully in the community for so many years? The absence of forced entry further deepened the mystery. If the killer had not broken into the house, that could only mean one thing. The murderer was someone close to the victims, and someone who was trusted enough to gain access to the home without suspicion. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, there were no signs of robbery. Nothing had been taken from the house. No valuables were missing. It wasn't about money or theft. It was about something far more sinister. As the investigators processed the scene, a chilling realization began to set in. The killer could have been someone from within the family, someone who knew the house, knew the routines, knew the vulnerabilities of its inhabitants. Could it have been a stranger who just happened to know the family's routines? Or, as the investigators started to suspect, could it be someone closer to home? Could it be Amy? The police began to interview Amy immediately. She was shaken, distraught, and still in shock. Amy spoke of how she had come to visit the house the morning after the killings, to find the bodies of her mother, stepfather, and grandparents. She was certain it wasn't a robbery. She knew there was no reason anyone would steal anything from her family. She said she had no idea who could have done such a thing and expressed complete disbelief at the violence that had taken place.
So yeah, it's like a movie or something. It's not supposed to be real life.
But something about Amy's story didn't sit right with investigators. The fact that Amy had been living just a few steps away from her family raised questions. Her proximity to the crime scene made her an early person of interest. But there was something else. Something about the way Amy acted that didn't quite match the gravity of the situation. It was hard to put into words, but her reactions, her mannerisms, her level of shock, it all seemed a little too calm, almost too rehearsed. Was Amy involved in some way? Was she possibly hiding something? As the investigation began, detectives turned their focus to the entire family. They dug into Amy's relationships with her parents, her financial troubles, and her recent interactions with Ross. What they found was troubling. Amy and Ross had been dealing with mounting debts. Their pet grooming business had been struggling, and their finances were in disarray. Ross had been growing increasingly frustrated with their situation, and so had Amy. But the detectives didn't stop there. They also examined the Scott family's history. Had there been any bad blood, any grudges between Amy and her family? It wasn't long before they uncovered something disturbing, a series of arguments between Amy and her mother, Kathy. In fact, those closest to the family would later admit that the relationship between Amy and her mother had always been strained. Could there have been a deeper motive than just financial issues? The scene was set. The investigation had just begun, and the police were already grappling with more questions than answers. The town of Pendleton was shaken to its core. A once peaceful community was now gripped by the possibility that someone they knew, someone they trusted, might have been responsible for such a horrifying crime. As the investigation deepened, so too did the suspicions surrounding Amy Vilardi. Was she truly the innocent daughter who discovered her family's tragic end? Or was there something more sinister at play, lurking beneath the surface? And the bigger question remained: who could have done this to the Scott family, and why? As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly come together. But the truth, it seemed, was far darker and more complex than anyone could have imagined. The investigation was far from over, and the most chilling part of the story was yet to come. As the investigation into the brutal murders of Kathy Scott, Mike Scott, Violet Taylor, and Barbara Scott unfolded, the authorities found themselves drawn deeper into a tangled web of lies, deception, and unspoken grudges. Each new piece of evidence only seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the more they learned about Amy Vilardi, the more unsettling the case became. After Amy's initial statement to the police, investigators focused on gathering as much information as possible. They quickly discovered that Amy had a complicated relationship with her family, particularly with her mother, Kathy. Though Amy had always portrayed herself as a devoted daughter, the truth painted a different picture. Investigators spoke to friends and neighbors who recalled heated arguments between Amy and Kathy, with the two women often clashing over everything from financial decisions to Amy's marriage with Ross. Amy's mother, Kathy, had been the backbone of the family. She had taken care of everything: the house, the bills, and, in recent years, the health of her elderly parents. But as her health began to decline, Kathy's authority over the family started to fray. Amy had been caught in the middle, trying to balance her responsibilities toward her mother and her own life. But the financial strain of running a business with Ross, combined with the pressure of caring for her aging family, began to wear on Amy. Her frustration with her mother reached a boiling point. Interviews with the family's neighbors painted a clearer picture. Many described Amy as being under a lot of stress in the months leading up to the murders. Ross's pet grooming business had been struggling, and both he and Amy were facing mounting debt. It was clear that the couple had been living well beyond their means, and their financial troubles were compounding daily. Despite their outward appearances, things were far from ideal. As the police dug deeper, they uncovered serious financial difficulties. The Vilardis were in debt, and their business was barely breaking even. Even more concerning, investigators discovered that Amy and Ross had life insurance policies on both of their mothers, Kathy and Barbara. These policies, which amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, raised an obvious question. Could financial gain have been a motive for the murders? But it wasn't just the finances that were troubling. As police sifted through the family's personal records, they found a disturbing pattern of behavior. Amy had been secretly withdrawing money from her mother's account in the weeks leading up to the murders. She had also been in contact with loan sharks, seeking to borrow money despite the couple's already significant debt. The question arose: was Amy desperate enough to resort to violence to solve her financial problems? While investigators pieced together Amy's troubled financial situation, they began to focus more closely on her emotional state leading up to the murders. Amy's friends and co-workers reported that in the weeks before Halloween, she had become increasingly isolated and withdrawn. She had stopped answering calls from friends and had been spending more time alone with Ross. Her demeanor, once warm and outgoing, had turned cold and distant. But the most chilling revelation came when investigators uncovered phone records between Amy and Ross. They were able to trace several calls made in the days prior to the murders, all of which seemed to be centered around family discussions and making things right. These cryptic messages raised alarm bells. What did they mean by making things right? Was this a reference to something more sinister? Had Amy and Ross been discussing something even darker in those final days? The police began to dig even deeper into Amy's relationship with Ross. They uncovered texts and emails between the couple that hinted at suspicion and tension. Amy and Ross had argued frequently about money, but more troubling were the messages that seemed to show a lack of remorse over their growing financial problems. As Amy's frustration with her family deepened, her communications with Ross became more intense and urgent. One particularly disturbing message, sent by Amy just days before the murders, read, "If we don't do something soon, we're going to lose everything. This is our last chance." This chilling text was sent in the dead of night, shortly before the murders occurred. It was the kind of message that hinted at desperation and plans that were set in motion long before the violence erupted. As the police delved deeper into Amy and Ross's financial situation, they uncovered even more disturbing information. Credit card bills and bank statements revealed a string of suspicious transactions, many of which were linked to the purchases of high-end items that the couple could not afford. Jewelry, electronics, and even vacations, all seemingly purchased on credit, pointed to a pattern of reckless spending and an increasingly unsustainable lifestyle. The financial strain and the mounting debts seemed to provide the final motive. Amy and Ross were trapped in a cycle of financial ruin, and the only way out was to find a solution that would resolve their problems once and for all. But what had started as a plan to improve their lives soon spiraled into something darker, more violent. As the investigation continued, the police began to focus more closely on the evidence they had gathered. They had discovered that Amy's fingerprints were found on the weapon used in the murders, as well as on several of the life insurance policies. The evidence pointed in one direction. Amy had orchestrated the murders of her family. But the question still remained. Why? In the weeks following the murders, as the police closed in on Amy, the town of Pendleton was rocked by the revelation that someone so close to the victims could have been capable of such violence. Theories about Amy's motives, ranging from financial desperation to long, simmering resentment, began to spread like wildfire through the community. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Amy, once the loving daughter, was now being painted as the mastermind behind the murders, and the more investigators uncovered, the darker the picture became. What had driven her to commit such horrific acts against her own family? Was it simply money? Or was there something deeper, more personal at play? The investigation had taken a new turn. And now, it seemed, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But even with the evidence mounting against her, the true motive behind the murders of the Scott family still remained shrouded in mystery. What did Amy stand to gain from her family's deaths, and what kind of woman could carry out such a brutal and heartless crime? As the police continued to piece together the fragments of evidence, the town of Pendleton was left wondering. Could anyone really know the truth behind the cold-blooded killings of Kathy, Mike, Violet, and Barbara Scott? And more importantly, would justice ever be served? The quiet town of Pendleton had barely recovered from the shock of the Scott family murders when the investigation took a chilling turn. As the evidence against Amy Vilardi continued to mount, the authorities knew they had to act fast. The case that had stayed cold for over 8 years was now inching toward a conclusion. And it was going to be more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The months following the murders had been filled with tension and uncertainty. But despite the grisly nature of the crime, Amy Vilardi had been allowed to live her life, her name still untainted by suspicion in the eyes of most of the community. But investigators were relentless. They had slowly pieced together her financial troubles, her suspicious behavior, and the mounting pressure from her own debts and strained relationships. It all pointed toward one thing. Amy had more than just a passing connection to the murders of her family. The breakthrough came in late 2023, when new leads began to surface. Authorities had spent years carefully re-examining old evidence, looking at the case with fresh eyes. Forensic specialists revisited the crime scene, reanalyzing physical evidence that had once been dismissed as inconclusive. New technology allowed them to re-examine DNA traces and fingerprints, and when they ran the evidence through updated databases, something unexpected came up. Well, Amy's fingerprints were found on more than just the weapons and the life insurance policies. They were found on the murder weapon, on the cash found at the scene, and even on various documents that painted a clearer picture of the financial web she had spun in the months leading up to the murders. Investigators now had enough to connect Amy Vilardi to the crime, and the truth was starting to reveal itself in terrifying clarity. In early December 2023, Amy Vilardi was arrested. The Anderson County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Attorney General's Office were both involved in the operation. They moved quickly, securing Amy in her home just days after the evidence reached a breaking point. When she was taken into custody, it was the first time that her involvement in the murders was openly acknowledged, and it sent shockwaves through the small town. The arrest of Amy Vilardi was a moment of bitter realization. For those who knew her, the person who had always been known as the loving daughter, the devoted wife, and the business owner, was now exposed as something far darker. The community, still reeling from the initial shock of the murders, now had to contend with the uncomfortable truth. One of their own had been responsible for the brutal deaths of an entire family. As Amy was brought in for questioning, her demeanor was strikingly calm. She was taken to the Anderson County Detention Center, where she was formally charged with 4 counts of murder. During her interrogation, the authorities were keenly aware of her ability to remain composed under pressure. Her answers were measured, almost rehearsed, as if she had anticipated the questions. But as the details of the investigation were laid out before her, the walls began to close in. Amy's initial response was one of disbelief. She insisted that she was innocent, claiming she had nothing to do with the deaths of her family. However, as the interrogators presented the overwhelming evidence, the money trail, the life insurance policies, the texts, and phone records, Amy's confidence began to falter. She claimed she had been in shock when she found the bodies, and that her actions after the murders were consistent with someone who had lost their loved ones. But as investigators dug deeper, they found more troubling details that suggested Amy's involvement was far from incidental. The phone records revealed that she had made multiple calls to her husband, Ross, in the hours before the murders. There was no way to explain these calls, especially when the police found a text from Amy sent to Ross just before the murders saying, "We have to end this. It's our last chance." The police now had the final pieces of the puzzle. Amy and Ross had plotted the murders together, driven by financial desperation. Their debts had become insurmountable, and with no clear way out, they had turned to murder. But it wasn't just about the money. The family, particularly Kathy Scott, had become an obstacle in their path, an obstacle that had to be removed for their plan to succeed. The police knew they had their suspect, but the biggest question still lingered. Why? What had pushed Amy to go so far? What was it that had made her decide to kill her own family? Was it purely financial, or was there something deeper, more personal, at play? Amy's arrest marked a significant turning point in the case. But even with her in custody, the investigation was far from over. Ross Vilardi, Amy's husband, was also arrested shortly after her. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge him with the same 4 counts of murder. Ross, too, had been complicit in the plot to kill the Scott family. However, unlike Amy, Ross was far less composed during his interrogation. His answers were less consistent, and his demeanor seemed to shift from defiant to remorseful, as if he were realizing the gravity of his involvement. Ross's arrest did little to shed more light on the underlying motives behind the killings. But the more the authorities dug into the lives of the Vilardi, the more they began to uncover the darkness that had been festering beneath the surface. The couple's relationship had been riddled with unresolved tensions, particularly over money. Ross, once an easygoing man, had grown increasingly erratic as their debts grew. And Amy, once a loving daughter, had become someone completely different, someone capable of cold-blooded murder. For months after the arrests, the town of Pendleton was filled with whispers. Everyone who had known the Vilardis had trouble reconciling the image of the couple they had known with the horrifying reality that had come to light. But as the trial loomed on the horizon, everyone was eager to see what would happen next. What would the defense say? How would Amy and Ross explain themselves? The town, still reeling from the shock, would soon find out. The arrests of Amy and Ross Vilardi set the stage for the next chapter in this chilling tale. As the case moved forward, the shocking details of their financial struggles, their lies, and their unthinkable actions would continue to unfold. The trial would reveal even darker truths, and the true extent of the Vilardis' desperation would come to light. But for now, the arrests were just the beginning. The answers to the questions that had haunted Pendleton for so long were just beginning to surface. And the truth was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The stage was set for the trial of the century, and everyone would be watching, waiting to see how this twisted story would end. As the investigation continued to unfold, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together with chilling precision. The more the authorities delved into the lives of Amy and Ross Vilardi, the clearer it became that the brutal murders of Kathy Scott, Mike Scott, Violet Taylor, and Barbara Scott were not just acts of violence, but the tragic culmination of years of desperation, financial ruin, and hidden resentment. The deeper the detectives dug, the more they uncovered about the Vilardis' financial struggles. On the surface, Amy and Ross had lived what appeared to be an average, modest life. But beneath the facade, their world had been unraveling for months. Their business, a pet grooming service, had been failing for years. It had been their last hope, but it wasn't bringing in enough money to cover the bills. Amy had stopped opening up to her friends, and Ross, once a cheerful and easygoing man, had become increasingly withdrawn. The mounting debt, the failing business, and the pressure of living paycheck to paycheck were starting to take their toll. What the investigators found next made the motive behind the murders disturbingly clear. Life insurance policies. Amy and Ross had taken out large life insurance policies on both of Amy's parents, Kathy and Barbara, as well as on Violet Taylor and Mike Scott. The policies totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The policies had been taken out only months before the murders, and each of the victims had beneficiaries listed: Amy and Ross. The authorities quickly realized that these policies would provide them with the financial windfall they so desperately needed. With both of Amy's parents gone, the couple would stand to inherit not only the life insurance payout, but also the family's assets, including the house and any valuables the victims had accumulated over the years. It wasn't just the financial desperation that drove Amy to this horrific act. It was the fact that the financial collapse had already pushed her to the brink. Amy's once strong bond with her mother had fractured beyond repair. Friends and family members had noted the rising tension between them in the months leading up to the murders. Kathy had begun to question Amy's involvement in the family business, and the financial difficulties were adding even more strain to an already fragile relationship. Amy, feeling cornered, had become increasingly resentful. She was also haunted by the looming fear that her mother, the matriarch of the family, was slowly slipping away due to her declining health. But Kathy wasn't just a mother to Amy. She was the one who had always held the reins, the one who made the financial decisions, the one who provided the safety net. If Kathy were to pass away, Amy could finally break free from the overwhelming burden of her financial troubles. In a twisted turn of events, Amy's husband, Ross, was complicit in the murders. Though he had been an unwilling participant at first, his own financial struggles made it impossible for him to say no. Ross had been fully aware of the plan, and despite any lingering reservations, he had gone along with it. The money from the insurance policies was too tempting, and the idea of finally being free from their debts overshadowed any moral qualms. The couple was desperate, and this was their only way out. The murder was methodically planned. Amy had thought this through carefully over the course of several weeks. She knew that Kathy and Barbara would be at home that night, preparing for Halloween. The house would be quiet, and there would be little chance of anyone interrupting their plans. Amy and Ross knew their family's routine well. They knew when Kathy would go to bed, and when the elderly women would be settled for the night. It was a Halloween night like no other. While the streets of Pendleton were filled with the excitement of trick-or-treaters, the Scott family was blissfully unaware of the horrific fate that awaited them. The atmosphere inside their home was calm, perhaps even mundane, as Kathy and Mike settled in for the evening. The elderly women curled up with their books. Amy, meanwhile, was at home with Ross, likely preparing for what they had planned. Amy and Ross had already laid the groundwork. Amy had cut off all communication with other family members in the days leading up to the murder. No one knew about the growing resentment Amy felt for her family, and no one suspected that this Halloween night would mark the beginning of the end. As the clock struck the early hours of the morning, Amy and Ross moved into position. They knew the time was right. With deadly precision, they went inside the Scott home. What happened inside was beyond comprehension. The level of violence was shocking, but the lack of remorse from both Amy and Ross was even more disturbing. Amy had, in her mind, justified the killings as a necessary step toward a brighter future. Her family had to die in order for her to escape her crushing financial burden. As the murders unfolded, Amy's calculated demeanor never wavered. The bodies of Kathy, Mike, Violet, and Barbara were discovered, but at that point, it was already too late for any intervention. The gruesome scene that Amy had left behind was one that would haunt everyone involved. Her ability to carry out such a horrific act without hesitation or remorse was chilling, a sign of just how far her desperation had pushed her. What was even more chilling was the fact that Amy had planned everything meticulously, even ensuring that the murder was covered up in such a way that it would be difficult to trace back to her. She believed, at least initially, that she would get away with it. The police had no evidence linking her directly to the crime. Amy had taken the necessary precautions, including erasing phone messages and texts that could have implicated her. But what Amy didn't anticipate was the tenacity of the investigators. Despite her efforts to cover her tracks, the authorities began to piece together the chilling reality of what had transpired. They delved into her past, her financial records, her communications with Ross, and every other detail of her life that had seemed unrelated at first. They uncovered the life insurance policies that had been taken out shortly before the murders. They found the texts and emails exchanged between Amy and Ross that painted a picture of a couple consumed by financial desperation. But they discovered the records of bank accounts and transfers that showed Amy had planned to use the money from the insurance policies to get out of the mess they were in. The evidence against her was undeniable, and with every new discovery, the weight of Amy's guilt began to grow heavier. As investigators uncovered more about Amy's role in the murders, it became clear that her actions were driven by a combination of financial desperation, personal grievances, and the chilling realization that she saw no other way out. But the most disturbing aspect of all was that she was willing to destroy her entire family in order to escape her debts. The tragic reality was that despite the planning and the cold-hearted execution, the murders of Kathy, Mike, Violet, and Barbara Scott did not bring Amy the peace she had hoped for. Instead, it set off a chain of events that would unravel her life in ways she could never have predicted. The authorities had now gathered enough evidence to charge Amy with 4 counts of murder. But the question still loomed large. Why had she done it? What had pushed her to such extremes? And perhaps most importantly, how could someone who had once seemed so loving, so devoted, be capable of such a heinous crime? As Amy faced the reality of her actions, the true depth of her depravity began to surface. This was no simple case of financial desperation. This was the story of a woman willing to go to any lengths to escape the crushing weight of her own failures and destroy everything she had once loved in the process. The town of Pendleton, South Carolina, had barely begun to process the shocking revelations surrounding the brutal murders of Kathy Scott, Mike Scott, Violet Taylor, and Barbara Scott. As the news of Amy Vilardi's arrest spread, many couldn't believe the woman they had known for years as a loving daughter, wife, and businesswoman could be capable of such violence. The question on everyone's mind was, how could she have done it? But the truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. Amy's arrest was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would reveal the depths of her deception, the lies she had woven to cover up her role in the murders, and the sinister motives that had driven her to kill her own family. The case soon drew national attention. As the first hearing date approached, all eyes were on the small courthouse in Anderson County. Amy's trial promised to be a spectacle, a story of betrayal, greed, and family secrets. And the town, which had once considered Amy a neighbor and friend, now had to confront the horrifying reality that someone they had known for years was capable of such a chilling crime. The court proceedings began in February 2026. The Anderson County Courthouse, a modest building nestled in the heart of the town, was packed with spectators, press, and families of the victims. Emotions were running high as the prosecutor, along with the defense, prepared to present their cases. The prosecution had already laid out the overwhelming evidence against Amy, including the life insurance policies she had taken out on her parents and the money trail that led back to her and Ross. But the defense was prepared to fight. And Amy, who had once appeared calm and composed in her interviews, was now ready to defend herself. Amy's defense team, led by a seasoned criminal lawyer, wasted no time in denying her involvement. They claimed that the evidence against her was circumstantial and that there was no concrete proof linking her directly to the murders. According to her attorney, Amy was simply a victim of circumstance, someone trapped in a toxic family dynamic, pushed to her breaking point by financial strain and personal conflict. They painted Amy as a woman who had loved her family deeply and who had been shattered by the tragedy. But the prosecution had a different story. They knew that the evidence told a much darker tale. They began by presenting the life insurance policies that Amy and Ross had taken out on the victims. The timing was damning. Just months before the murders, Amy and Ross had arranged for the policies, which would ultimately pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars. The prosecutor argued that this was not an act of desperation to pay off debts, but a calculated plan to secure their financial future at the expense of 4 innocent lives. Amy had murdered her family to inherit their wealth, and the motive couldn't be clearer. The prosecutor also presented the phone records between Amy and Ross, which showed a disturbing pattern of communication in the days leading up to the murders. In one chilling text message, Amy had written to Ross, "We have to make this happen. There's no other way out." The defense tried to explain this away as a misinterpretation, but the jury could see the gravity of the situation. Amy and Ross had discussed the murders before they even took place. The prosecution's case was solid, and the more they revealed, the harder it was for Amy's defense to deny her involvement. In addition to the phone records, the prosecution introduced witness testimony from Amy's friends, family members, and even employees who had worked with her. They spoke of Amy's growing frustration with her family and her financial troubles. They revealed that Amy had made secret withdrawals from her mother's bank account in the weeks leading up to the murders and had even been in contact with loan sharks and debt collectors, trying to borrow money despite her already substantial debts. The story of Amy's desperation was becoming clearer with every witness that took the stand. But the most powerful moment in the trial came when the prosecution called Amy's father, Mike Scott, to the stand. The victims' families, who had been sitting quietly in the courtroom, were now waiting to hear the most critical testimony of the entire trial. Mike had been the head of the family, the man who had provided for them and who had taken care of Amy and her siblings throughout their lives. His testimony was meant to shed light on the relationship between Amy and her parents, and what it had been like for them in the weeks before the murders. Mike described his daughter's troubled relationship with Kathy, revealing how the two women had been at odds for years. He spoke of the constant tension in the house and how Amy had grown increasingly resentful toward her mother, especially after Kathy's health began to decline. Amy had always felt like she was carrying the weight of the family on her shoulders, he explained. But Mike also described how Amy had become distant in the weeks leading up to the murders, often locking herself away from the rest of the family and avoiding contact with anyone who might try to intervene. As Mike spoke about his daughter, the courtroom fell silent. It was clear that he was devastated by the loss of his family, but his words were also an indictment of Amy's actions. He spoke of his own sense of betrayal, not just by Amy, but by the person he had trusted most in the world. After days of testimony, the case against Amy seemed almost irrefutable. The prosecution had presented a damning array of evidence: the life insurance policies, the phone records, the financial struggles, and the emotionally charged testimony from those closest to her. But Amy, despite the mounting evidence, continued to maintain her innocence. She sat silently in the courtroom, her eyes downcast, seemingly unable to reconcile the image of the woman she once was with the charges against her. The defense, however, continued to insist that Amy had been driven to desperation by a combination of family pressure, financial ruin, and personal conflicts. They argued that while Amy may have been involved in the events leading up to the murders, she had not been the one to carry them out. Instead, they suggested that someone else, possibly Ross, had played a more significant role in the crime. The trial was far from over, and with the defense continuing to argue that the case against Amy was not as solid as it appeared, the final verdict seemed uncertain. But one thing was clear: the family of Kathy, Mike, Violet, and Barbara Scott had been torn apart in the most horrific way imaginable. And now, the woman they had once loved and trusted, Amy Vilardi, was standing trial for the murder of her own family.